In the 70s, there was a large movement among many of the young, especially the hippies, and as you can tell, I am still one of those hippies. There was a back to land movement. People, you've got to understand a lot of what the hippie was about was anti-establishment. They weren't, well, they were environmentalists, but they were doing things to prove that you could live a different lifestyle than generally was being lived by most people at that time. And so I was one part of that group. There was a town in New Mexico called Petaca that many of the hippies moved into and bought up the farms. And their primary intention was to be able to farm in the natural way, not using fertilizers, not using genetically altered grains and things. They just were wanting to just live a life very much, you might say, that it was like maybe 100 years ago, 100 years before that. And so many of them moved into the area and bought the farms and fixed up the house. Some of them made geodetic domes, and and it was a small town in the forest. I guess altogether there maybe been 20 or 30 people living there. But the village itself was an old Spanish village, and now I use the word Spanish because it was not Mexican. These were Spanish people who came from Spain and settled in that area. And they lived in the forests. These villages were very isolated, small little villages up and down the Rio Grande. And so people moved in and began to farm. And some of them were a little extreme. One of the things to prove that you live off the land. So some of the group just lived off the wild vegetation that was around. Of course, many of them, most of them, I would say, were not meat eaters. They're very much into being vegetarians, being purists in that area. So it went very well, except after a while, there began to become some of the children who had fought in the War of Vietnam, and I guess being warriors and fighters or whatever, they decided that they were going to drive out all the gringos, all the Anglos, all the non-Spanish population. And so they armed themselves with machine guns and rifles and things like that, and went about chasing all the gringos out. And after they left, what they would do would burn their houses to the ground so they could not return. Well, that's a sad part of that, and it's a shame that it happened. But I want to point out that being that so-called discrimination is not against blacks or Spanish or whatever. The minority group were Anglos, English-speaking white people, and most of them were from middle-class homes, so they weren't exactly the undesirable group. But since they were in the minority, they were hated, disliked, not associated with, discriminated against, and finally driven out of town. Now, that's just a side note to what I'm saying here. It's like we all have this whole thing in the United States, a minority groups, the Spanish, and that we're white supremacists. Hey, we have it all built in us, okay? We all tend to be against a minority group for one reason or another. Okay, that's not exactly what I wanted to say. Mostly my theme is on survival and back to nature. At that time, I wasn't back to nature so much. I lived in the village because it was cheap. My rent was $5 a month. No one charged for electricity, and there weren't, and the water was in the local springs, so living there was very inexpensive. I guess it was also my experiment with, how you can live on nothing. And I did that. I lived on nothing. I will admit that I did get food stamps, okay? And that supplied most of my food. I wasn't into hunting and eating the local vegetation. I was still doing it the way that most of us are doing it, okay? So I lived in this town for, I don't know, a year or two. Uh, it was like going back in history. The houses were made of adobe, or they were made of sort of a small timber, and they weren't in the best of conditions. So the only room in the house that was livable was the kitchen. So that's where we lived. It was a big room. But one of the main reasons for that was there was a good old wood stove in the kitchen. And so we cooked on it. And in the wintertime, that's how we stayed warm. And the wood, well, remember I was living in the middle of the woods, and the Forest Service would cut down or clear out areas for the animals to have a pasture, to grass and stuff to live on. And so we would go and collect that timber, no cost, okay, and we burn that wood all winter for staying warm. So in fun analysis, you might say that I ended up living on practically nothing. Well, I guess I'm telling the story of petaca before I tell the story of what else I want to do, like living on the land. Maybe I'll make that another part. But we lived there. We had no problem because it so happened the landowner who owned the house was one of the group, and he was much revered because he was a penitente, I'm not quite sure, but penitence type of organization. They would beat themselves with whips and things. That was a form of religion that they practiced. It was penitentes. I think that's the word, penitentes. Okay, they were penitents, and so they lived a very severe type of life. The religious, like for example, at Easter time, they would reenact the crucifixion, meaning everything, including hanging someone on the cross. Well, it was quite an honor to be hung on a cross. They didn't kill him. They didn't drive nails through him, but he did spend quite a bit of time on the cross. And okay, it's all part of the penitence. It's all part of their religion, which had a lot of suffering to it. And it was interesting living in that town. I guess I might as well go ahead with that. It was a town, as I said, Spanish was the language. Of course, they spoke English too, because they were part of America now. So there was a complete community. There was one person in the community who was a medicine man, you might say. You went to him when you had illnesses, and he prescribed certain herbs and things for your wellness. And he also delivered the babies when there was babies being delivered. He would deliver the babies. He was quite an interesting person. I enjoyed talking to him and finding these things out. Here it is in 1970s, and this is practices that goes maybe back to the 18th century or something. But there it was. They were totally self-sufficient, and they farmed and got hunted deer in the forest, and sort of lived off the land. So that sort of matched our back to land type of theme, because they hadn't changed in their way of living. I guess for a couple hundred years they were still living the same lifestyle. I really enjoyed being there. It was a shame what happened with the young people. They got all fired up by the Vietnam War and whatever, and felt that they had to still continue the war somehow or another in their own community. And I tried a lot to bring the community up to snuff. I tried, because most of the people, a lot of the people in the community, many of the people in the community were on welfare. There was no jobs, of course, in the middle of the forest. There's no jobs. The only jobs that was available was fighting fires, and the problem with people in petaca is there was no telephones, so there's only word of mouth. So when a fire broke out, they sent out the word that they needed firefighters, that is, need warm bodies that could go out with a spade and a bucket and fight the fires. And so unfortunately they had no telephone, so they didn't get the word until it was too late. And this was one of the main ways of making enough money to live on in this community. So at that time, I was making a living. I wasn't entirely. I had decided I needed to make a living, and so I decided to make leather goods. Back in New York City, where I was living before this, I was a street vendor, and I sold leather goods on the streets of New York, and I made my living that way. And so I sort of knew the business. I knew what I needed to do. So I decided that what I was going to do is now make leather goods, and the simplest thing to make is here's a little break there. I just realized I was talking such a long period of time, and I hadn't checked to see if my voice was being recorded. But it was, and I just checked it out, and I'll add this to it. So I decided to help the community by setting up a factory. At that time, there's a lot of government help for setting up businesses for minority groups or for poverty-stricken people. And so I would get some help from the government regarding that, mostly equipment like sewing machines and so forth like that. So I said, well, let's set up a industry here in this small town in the forest. It's sort of like the cottage industries that Gandhi did. So I was taking a page out of Gandhi's book, and I decided, okay, I'm going to start this company in this little town of petaca. And there was a schoolhouse. They used to have, the school was located in the village and had a teacher there, but the government had decided that they were going to centralize the educational system, so it was empty, and it was available to me. So I said, fine, that's perfect. Now I'm going to set up a factory in that schoolhouse. I asked the people in the community, would you work for me if I start a company here in the village. And they all said, yeah. I said, well, you'll lose your welfare probably. And they said, no, we'd rather be working than living on welfare. It's just that there's no work here. We were working in the mica mines, but they closed down some years ago. So I needed to set it up. Okay, I could get the equipment from the government. I had the employees, the people who worked locally. I would teach them what to do. I would manufacture it and sell the stuff in Santa Fe or even Albuquerque. So I needed some important part to this piece. I needed telephones. So, I couldn't wonder why you didn't have telephones. I mean, I asked people why they didn't have telephones, and they said, well, we asked for telephones, we never got any. So I went to the state government, and I went to the telephone company, and I said, Petaca doesn't have any telephones. Why is that? He said, well, no one ever requested them. Well, I said to them, I'm requesting telephones. They said, glad, we're happy to give you telephones. Now, you got to realize they had to run a line in quite a distance from the main line, maybe 10, 15 miles. But they were willing to do that, to give telephones to these people. So they said to me, what you need to do is get subscribers, people who want to have telephones. So I went to all my neighbors and asked them, if they would like to have telephones. And all of them said, of course we'd like to have telephones. We always wanted telephones, but we didn't know how to do it. And I said, well, I'm doing it. So the only thing I need your name and your subscription that you want a telephone installed in your home. Well, I went back to the telephone company with all the subscribers, and within a few months, they ran telephone lines into Petaca. Now everybody had telephones. It was wonderful. Now they can call their relatives. They can call a doctor in an emergency. But not only that, this might hurt my project, but not only that, they can now receive a telephone call and answer and get jobs fighting fires. They were no longer isolated and jobless. Well, that made me feel pretty good, you know what I mean? And then again, I later on I brought in the library mobile unit, which they could borrow books now. And in other words, I was moving this community from the 18th century up to the 20th century. At that time, it was the 20th century, okay? And I felt good about that. And everybody felt good about that. It sort of helped the Anglo or the minority white group, non-Spanish speaking, be more acceptable in the community. Well, this all happened before the kids came home and started their campaign to drive all non-Spanish people out of the community. So when that happened, I said, no, it's impossible. I don't know, they burned down the school or whatever they're going to do. I just felt that it was not a good thing to do. So I decided then to move into Santa Fe and start my business there, to the shame of all. But there was much danger and much difficulty now involved in setting up my business. Okay, it's part of my theme of getting back to Europe, and also part of my theme of you don't need much to live on. And, there's always some way, somehow, if you're flexible, that you can make a living, that you can live, and that you can exist. So this is my part here on my experience in Petaca, New Mexico. There's much I want to tell you regarding this, But I'll stay on this theme, and I'll end here, and then I will go into the next part later. Okay, I'll see you people. I hope you listen to this. You got any comments, let me know.